Hi, you guys. Welcome back to part three on chapter 22, which has to do with World War II. So, when we left off, we were talking about women at work. And the Office of War Information, or the OWI, will do a great job of creating propaganda that will get women to work. And so, it's so effective that by 1944, nearly a third of the workplace is women. However, all of this work is depicted as temporary. It's never meant to be a rallying cry for women to work in the household. It's not about women changing their role in society. No, a lot of these jobs have been left vacant by the men because the men are fighting. And so now they needed the women to fill some of these vacant positions. And so now we continue with the National Resources Planning Board. What is this? What did they do? What was the purpose of it? So between 1942 and 1943, the National Resources Planning Board will offer a blueprint for the peacetime economy based on full employment, an expanded welfare state, and an American standard of living. So, with the next few minutes and some of the things that we'll talk about, some of the proposals by FDR and some of the proposals that we'll see, I would say seem pretty liberal at this time, because also the National Resources Planning Board will also call for a new Bill of Rights that would include all Americans in an expanded Social Security system and guarantee access to education, health care, adequate housing, and jobs for able bodied adults. However, Congress will eventually eliminate funding for the National Resources Planning Board. In 1944, Franklin Delano Roosevelt will call for what he will term an economic Bill of Rights. So, in this economic Bill of Rights, he proposed an expansion of the original Bill of Rights, which remember are the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. But his economic Bill of Rights will call for an expansion of the original Bill of Rights to secure full employment, adequate income, medical care, education, and a decent home for all Americans. Congress did not enact the Economic Bill of Rights. However, they will extend some benefits to soldiers returning from war. And so that is known as the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, or more really colloquially known as the GI Bill of Rights or the GI Bill. The GI Bill awarded members of the armed forces for their service and prevented widespread unemployment by offering unemployment pay and scholarships for education. And I would say, one of the biggest benefits is that it also offered low cost mortgage loans for soldiers returning from home or returning from war. So, this is a big one because it offers, remember, low cost mortgage loans. However, if you go back to our chapter on the Great Depression, you'll recall that the FHA, or the Federal Housing Administration, would not insure mortgages to Black people. They created something called redlining, which we'll talk about, especially in the 1950s, because we see the impact, I would say, really in the 1950s. Some of you are chose to read The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. You will get so much information. You will not be able to put that book down. I don't recommend bad books. I only recommend the best. And I will say that book, you will love it. It will definitely be enlightening for those of you who are reading that instead of at the dark end of the street. But I digress. The GI Bill, remember, will offer unemployment pay, scholarships for education, low cost mortgage loans, except if you're Black, pensions, as well as job training. Now, World War II also created, I would say, it creates a melting pot, but really it creates a melting pot for European immigrants and their children. If you are Black, if you are brown, America still will feel like that cafeteria tray where you live in areas with, if you're a Black, you live in an area more than likely with Black people because you're not able to get a home or a mortgage in a white neighborhood. More on redlining, and then I promise I'll go on. Many of these neighborhoods, especially when we talk about suburbs in the 1950s, which will be, I want to say, next chapter, in these burbs that are being built, in many of the burbs, there are covenants, which I would say are like rules for the neighborhood. And so, in many of these suburbs, in many of these burbs, the covenant said that you could not, Black people could not buy a home, they could not rent a home, they could not be resold a home, right? Anyways, I go back, I digress. World War II will create a vast melting pot, but really for those European immigrants and their children. The American way of life rested on brotherhood, this idea that people from different places could live together and become a united people. Now, the government will promote equality as a definition of Americanism and a counterpoint to Nazism. Okay, the government will promote equality as a definition of what it means to be American as a counterpoint to Nazism. The Office of War Information will highlight nearly every group's contribution to American life, and in an effort to really celebrate the strength of a united people, right? But the problem is that while the OWI, or the Office of War Information, is putting out this propaganda, it's not necessarily true in everyday life. In 1942, Ruth Benedict will write a book called Race and Racism, where she'll state that racism is a travesty of scientific knowledge. By the end of the war, racism and nativism was really, I would say, really began to be stripped of its intellectual respectability outside of the South. So a lot of like pseudoscience is being disproven. However, racism does not disappear from American life. On that note, we'll talk about the Bracero program. So, all while the OWI is promoting this unity and um, diversity and strength and diversity, we're also in America getting programs like the Bracero program. The Bracero program was agreed to by the Mexican and American governments in 1942. So, tens of thousands of contract laborers crossed into the United States to take jobs as agricultural workers and as domestics. And it was designed as a temporary response to a lot of these wartime labor shortages. But it lasts until 1964. The problem with the Bracero program is that it offers one, no path to citizenship. If you came over and you worked as a laborer, you could not become a citizen. You could be deported at any time. The working conditions were atrocious. The wages were exploitative and atrocious as well. So while we're celebrating diversity and equality, we're not practicing necessarily what we preach, because you would not pay a white American the amount of money that you are paying these migrant workers. About 500,000 Mexican American men and women will serve in the armed forces fighting for the United States of America. In 1943, and I always like to talk about this because it's really interesting to me, the Caucasian Race Equal Privileges Resolution is passed in 1943 in Texas. And it stated that since all nations of the North and South American continents were united in a struggle against Nazism, that all persons of the Caucasian race were entitled to equal treatment in places of public accommodation. And at this time, Mexican Americans were categorized as white. Now, it's not there, this also, I would say, it's significant to learn because this is also an issue that we still see. So for a program that I'm in now, I was doing some research on the city of Pasadena. And so I wanted to get some demographic information and census information for the city of Pasadena. In getting that census information, while Pasadena is a majority minority community. It is like 60 to 70% Latinx. Um, for a categorization on the census, there was just white, right? And so it comes out as saying that this community is 60 to 70% white, even though it's 60 to 70% Latinx. And this is an issue, especially during the census, this last census, that was a pretty big issue that you had groups that did not have adequate representation on the census. So this is an ongoing issue. I also talk about this because it's not a cultural designation as white. It is really a legal designation of white because whiteness comes came and comes with its own set of privileges. So if you are legally entitled or legally classified as white, that gives you voting privileges, that gives you spatial privileges, even though society, though, did not necessarily see them as white. And as you can see, if you are following along on my presentation, there's a sign that says this park was given for white people only. Mexicans and Negroes stay out. And that was on an order of the park board. So while you have this, it's not necessarily, it doesn't pan out, I would say, all the time. So Asian Americans in wartime, more than 50,000 Asian Americans fought in the Army, mostly, however, in all Asian units. In 1943, our Congress ended the complete exclusion of Asians into the country by enacting a quota. So in 1943, the annual limit of Chinese immigrants allowed into the United States, get ready for this number, the annual limit was 105. Not 105,000, 105. The government would also have, I would say the OWI also had a large amount of propaganda, a large amount of anti Asian propaganda. Government propaganda and war films depicted the Japanese incredibly negatively. They were viewed, often seen as animals. So rats and dogs and gorillas, they were seen as being incredibly bestial. They were seen as being subhuman. And a lot of this, again, you'll see another picture. I have a propaganda poster from this period that really depicts it's a Japanese man because the flag is on his hat, but he looks more like a gorilla. And this is some of the propaganda that the government will, this anti really Japanese pro war propaganda, this is what was put out. They blamed a lot of Japanese aggression on a violent racial or national character, meaning, oh, all Japanese are violent, all Japanese are bad. Now, this comes to a head um, with Executive Order 9066. Again, Executive Order 9066. This order will order the relocation of all persons of Japanese descent from their homes to internment camps. So, more than 110,000 men, women, and children were removed from their homes and placed in internment camps. Now, even though they're placed in these internment camps, even though more than two-thirds of those who were placed in internment camps were American citizens. More than two-thirds of the 110,000 men, women, and children who were placed in internment camps were American citizens. Um, Korematsu is a court case, a Supreme Court case during this time in 1944 called Korematsu versus the United States. In this case, the Supreme Court denied the repeal of Fred Korematsu, who was a Japanese American citizen who was arrested for refusing to present himself for internment. In 1988, the U.S. Congress um, apologized for internment. They issued a formal apology uh, for internment, and they offered the survivors of this reparations, financial reparations, in the form of $20,000. So if you were a survivor of the internment camps, if you were still alive in 1988, you were offered $20,000 in compensation for your trauma. Blacks in the war. I'll move on. Blacks in the war. The Army restricted the number of Black enlistees. The Navy only accepted Black men in like menial positions or like servant positions, so only as waiters or cooks. However, more than 1 million Black Americans will serve in the armed forces during World War II, and they will serve in segregated units, largely really confined to construction and transport and other non combat tasks. However, I'll place this video on your module. The Tuskegee Airmen. The Tuskegee Airmen were a group of Black airmen, and their job was to fly with bombers. Bomber planes, the problem with them is that they were slow and loud. So you could see them coming, they're easy to be shot down. The job of the Tuskegee Airmen was to ensure that bombers don't get shot down. So you're going into the danger to protect your bomber plane, and they never lost one. If you recall, in the 1930s, Eleanor Roosevelt actually rode with the Tuskegee Airmen. It's also during this period that we get the birth of the modern civil rights movement, beginning with A. Philip Randolph, who was a civil rights leader and also the founder of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. So, the sleeping car porters, they were, I would say, like the attendants, the flight attendants, I guess you could say, of the train. So, if you were on a train and you had a long journey, you would be in a sleeping car, and so they would come make sure your bed was together, they served you, they did all of these things. And so he had founded a union called the Brotherhood of the Sleeping Car Porters to make sure that these sleeping car porters were getting adequate pay and things of that nature. In July 1941, he called for a march on Washington. So this is 20, about what, 22 years or so before Martin Luther King's famous March on Washington. In this march, he demanded access to employment, an end to segregation, and he also wanted there to be a national anti lynching law. He also stated that racism or that racial discrimination was not only undemocratic and un American, it's actually pro Hitler. What if you have racial discrimination? What makes that different from what Hitler is doing? Unfortunately, there will have to be a part 4 due to technological difficulties, which is fine. So I'll come back talking about A. Philip Randolph and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters.